Welcome to this episode of Learning Fusion. In today's episode, we're going to be covering the DaVinci Resolve / Fusion pipeline of image processing. Additionally, we're going to be covering managing your resolutions and color bit depths. So let's roll this intro and let's get into it.
We're learning Fusion together. We'll learn 2D stuff and 3D stuff and particle stuff and compositing stuff, deep pixel stuff and tracking stuff, but not other stuff, but some other cool stuff, cause we're learning Fusion together.
So I know some of this stuff is kind of boring stuff to go over, but it's crucial when it comes to working with Fusion within DaVinci Resolve. And I know when I first started using Resolve in Fusion, this stuff used to frustrate the snot out of me. And the one thing is sizing, your resolutions would be different, or you'd make changes in the edit page that didn't show up in Fusion or vice versa. And it just seemed like nothing worked together. Well, everything works together. You just need to know how it works together. And it works together quite amazingly. So when you bring stuff into DaVinci Resolve, not just Fusion, just DaVinci Resolve, there's a flow of how everything works and interacts. So in the beginning, when you bring in your source media, that's the first step in the little flow process. So we just bring in our media. So if I look in our media pool, we've got our Fusion composition here, and we've got our little clip here. So this is our source media. So this is the first step of what's happening within Fusion or within DaVinci Resolve. And like I said, it doesn't matter how you bring this in. If I created a Fusion comp and brought media into the Fusion comp, it's still getting put into our little media pool here. And this is still the first step or the first process of what's going on. The next step is our raw debayering. And what raw debayering is basically decoding in your raw files or decoding whatever it needs to decode. So that's happening in the background. It's not something you tell it to do or something you see happening. Well, it is kind of something you tell it to do, because if we look at this raw image right here, this is just B-raw footage. And right now I have my little project color management set up on DaVinci YRGB. But if I change it to DaVinci YRGB color managed and hit save, now it's color managing my raw file. I don't have to color grade it. I don't have to do anything. This is just straight what it looked like out of the camera. So this image debayering, that's what's happening. So, and one thing to note is if I go into, if I turn that back off, let me go here, go back to my regular. If I go into Fusion, you notice it's just my raw footage here in Fusion as well. But if I go here and go to my little settings, color managed, hit save, and now if I go into Fusion, it's color managed within Fusion as well. So just so you know, when you color manage, it's going to color manage your log or your raw or any footage you bring in. That's not your standard sRGB type stuff or Rec 709. It's going to decode it and color manage it and change it to the standard color that it's supposed to be. So let's go back and change that back. So that is this step of what Fusion or what DaVinci Resolve is doing. The next step is our clip attributes. So if I go back to our media pool, right click, go down to our clip attributes, and anything that's happening or any changes we make in here, this is what this step is doing right now. So our source media into our raw debayering and then into our clip attributes. From that, then it gets fed straight into Fusion. So if we go into Fusion and we look at our little Fusion project, that is what's being fed into Fusion. Our source image that's been debayered with any clip attributes applied to it. And it is pulling this footage straight from our little edit page here, from our timeline. But don't get confused, and I don't think I really covered this when I was talking about bringing in media. On our edit page, we brought in a clip, we trimmed it down, and then we created a Fusion clip out of it just by hitting this little Fusion clip here. And it brought our media in, and it says timeline up here. So it's bringing our media source in from the timeline. So it doesn't matter what I change this to, even if I change it to media pool, it's still technically pulling from the media pool, not necessarily the actual timeline clip. So it's still pulling the info from the media pool. Now, the only difference is we don't have the ability to trim. So if I go to media pool, you notice I have no trim utilities here. But if I was to actually pull this clip in from my media pool, the full untrimmed clip, input it, and if I look, I've got these trim controls. So now I can trim. So if you're wondering where your trim controls went, that's because you need the actual full clip to be able to trim it correctly. It's not going to happen when you edit your footage on your timeline and bring it in. You're going to lose those trim controls. No matter what we change it to, timeline or media pool, we don't have them. However, when we bring it in from the media pool, if we change it to timeline, you notice we lost those trim controls. But if we go back to media pool, we now have trim controls. If we go back to timeline, it's going to switch to that timeline time. So just a little bit of info for you. So back to our little flow diagram. So that's what's happening, is bringing in our footage into Fusion. Now, what this means is anything we do on our edit page, we can't see yet because everything's happening within Fusion. Because our next step after that is anything that's happening on our editor cut page, meaning adjustments. So anything in our inspector, it's happening after Fusion. So if I go to our clip and I change our scale, I can change our rotation if I want. And if I go to our Fusion page, you notice we don't see any of those changes. And that's because Fusion takes place before our edit and cut page adjustments. So we can't see any of those. Now, mind you, there are a few settings in here that you can see. And those two are your lens correction. So any lens correction we do and any retime scaling. This doesn't mean retime meaning speed control. Like if we go up and we say change speed and all that stuff, this is actual retiming from, this is 24 frame per second. And it's retiming to our project, which is 30. So that type of retime and scaling is right here. So any of this retime controls in our lens correction is going to take effect. So if I cram our lens so it's crazy and I go to our Fusion page, you notice it's still there. So these are the only two that are going to transfer over to Fusion. Anything else is not. Now, the only way to actually apply this stuff when we go into Fusion, you want all those changes applied when we go into Fusion. The only way to do that is, let me just copy this so I can delete this over. If I right click and create a new Fusion clip or a new compound clip, it's going to transfer all that stuff. So meaning if I zoom in, let me change this, crazy. If I right click and say new Fusion clip, and go into Fusion, you can see we've got our changes. And it's not bringing in our original media. You see the changes because now we're actually bringing in this Fusion clip we just created. It's no longer bringing in our original media. It's using this Fusion clip we created. And there's no way to undo any of that stuff. So if I go back, now I can't change anything or well, I can, but it's going to be all wonky and crazy. So just be careful when you're creating Fusion comps from changes in your edit page. You're going to lose all those changes in your edit page. So let's delete that. And delete that. So as I said, it goes from Fusion into our edit/cut page adjustments. That's only adjustments. Because after this step, our next step is edit and cut page effects, whether that's resolve effects or any plugins or any OFX you put in, that's the next step. So if I go here, let's add an effect. So if I add film damage, this is happening, the film damage is happening after our little edit and cut page adjustments. So if I go here and let me actually find somewhere where there's a line. You notice there's a line right here in our little film damage. It's a little hard to see. But if I go here and go back to our video and I rotate it, you notice that line is not rotating. That is because this effect is taking place after this. And again, if I go to our Fusion tab, we can't see any of those. Because again, all of this is happening after our Fusion page effects. So let's go ahead and delete that effect. And let's reset our footage here. And to demonstrate that a little better, we can go to this one and I can add a film grain on it. So if I go to film grain and let's crank this up, crank our opacity, our textures, grain size, you can see we've got our little grain large there. But if I go to my Fusion composition and change the size of my Fusion composition, because I can do that, if you notice, our grain is staying the same size. No matter how large or how I rotate our Fusion composition, our grain is staying the same because that is happening after our Fusion effects. So let's delete that. And then after our Fusion or Edit Cut Page Resolve or plugin effects, then it goes to our color effects, which is our grading tab. Meaning if I go to our grading tab and I make some changes here, it's happening after all this stuff. But don't get confused, because the way the color grading tab is it re-inputs into your edit and your cut page so you can see what's happening with your colors. However, if we go to Fusion, it does not. So your color page doesn't reintroduce or output back into Fusion, only back into these steps here. So your edit cut page adjustment and your edit cut page resolve effects, it'll reintroduce itself into there. Additionally, our Fusion effects itself actually initially output straight to the color effects. Meaning I can go to our Fusion effects here. I don't have any changes on it. So if I went to our color grading tab here, I could change our color grading tab. If I go back to our edit page, you can see it made those adjustments. But if I was to make any changes, like go to my adjustments page here in my Fusion, change it, now it's simultaneously outputting that Fusion output to our adjustments page and our color effects page. I know it's confusing, but just so you know, that's how it's working. So let's go back to our grading here. Let's reset this and reset our node size there. Now there is one way you can see all this stuff that's happening within Fusion without actually affecting anything. Meaning if I went here and say, did our film grain, well, let's do film damage so we can see it a little better. And we rotated it, changed our size. And so now we've got our awesome little footage there. And if I go into our Fusion page, remember we can't see anything. But if I was to go to my media out and select this color, now I can see what's happening on my timeline there. So I could go double up and look at my original that's actually coming in. And then I could see my color being applied to my media out only. Meaning whatever we do in here, we're not going to see that applied. So even if I came here and let's rotate the angle crazy, go back to Fusion, you notice now our rotation is crazy, but our original is the same. So any effects we do, so if I came in here, threw something on it, change our size up. Now, if I was to move this around, you notice our little dot is moving crazy, and our output is because it's following our original image in here. But that is one way you can see what's actually happening on your timeline effects. If you have effects or any changes on your timeline, is to change your media out to color, or you can change it to none and just see the original. So that is the flow of Fusion effects. And like I said, it's important to know, because planning your edits and planning your Fusion project or your Fusion effects within your edits and everything is going to make a huge difference. So knowing how all this stuff works is going to help you edit and do your Fusion effects a little better. So let's clear all this up and let's talk about image resolution here. So by default, your Fusion compositions are going to be determined by your timeline settings. So if we go to our settings here, we look at our timeline resolution. I've got it set up at 3840 by 2160. So this is going to be our default fusion sizing, meaning if, let's go ahead and create a new fusion composition. And let's go ahead and stick it in there. If I go to our new fusion composition, and right now we have nothing, but if I bring anything in here, say a background or a text or anything, create anything, and I input it, it's going to create a fusion composition, which is at the resolution of 3840 by 2160, which is our timeline settings. So that's the default settings for your fusion sizing in its resolution. Now, mind you, some of this is going to change depending on what footage you bring in. For example, so I believe this clip is 4096 by 2160. So if I go into Fusion and bring in our media straight from our little timeline there, you can see our resolution is 4096 by 2160. So it's going to use the resolution of the media input that we bring in to determine what that resolution is. And same goes for our downscaling of our resolution. If I was to bring in, say, a piece of footage that was only HD, and I go to our Fusion page, you can see our footage is only 1920 by 1080. So anything we bring in from our timeline and it's in its raw clip format, it's going to create a fusion at that resolution. Now, if I was to right click and say, create a new compound clip or a new fusion clip. So right here, if I said new fusion clip and I go to fusion, you can see our resolution is now 3840 by 2160. Because if we create a compound clip or a new fusion clip within our timeline on our edit page or our cut page, it's going to resize those clips to our timeline settings. Now, there are ways within Fusion to resize some of our clips. And just mind you, when we use stuff like the transform, this isn't actually going to resize our clip. So if I go to my transform and I say change my size down or up, we're maintaining the same resolution here, the 4096 by 2160. We're just transforming the size of that clip within that resolution. But to be able to change resolution, we have options. So we can use the shift space. I can use a crop node. So if I bring in a crop node and I go here and I just type in 3840, now we just cropped our footage down to 3840 by 2160, which is our timeline resolution. And I can go over to my offset and I can change the offset of that. But now our resolution is the same resolution as our timeline. Additionally, I can use a letterbox. So shift space, letterbox. If I go to my letterbox, I can change this to 3840 by 2160. And it's going to shrink it down, but it's going to leave letterboxes in the top and the bottom. Kind of the same thing it does within our timeline. Another option is to use the resize node. So if I bring in a resize node, I can resize the resolution. So I can do 3840, but it's not going to maintain that resolution correctly. So you notice it just shrunk it down. So 3840 by 2160, all it did is squish our footage in. And even if we say keep frame aspect ratio, now it just changed our 2160 and it's keeping that same aspect ratio. So when you're going from large to small, using the resize isn't the best. And we can also use the scale node. So if I bring in the scale, I can scale it up or down. And if you notice, if we look at our little numbers, it's just scaling the entire thing up or down. So these are the 4 nodes we can use to actually change the resolution of our footage in our different assets within Fusion itself. But what one you use is going to depend on what size footage you have. So our best bet to go from big to small would be to use the letter or the crop. So for this instance, if I basically wanted to get my 4096 by 2160 down to 3840 by 2160, just use the crop node. I would stick it in and just crop that down to 3840 by 2160. and everything I add afterwards. So if I add a text node onto that, you can see we're still working at 3840 by 2160, and our media out is 3840 by 2160. So a real world situation basically would be, say we created a fusion composition and it's using our timeline settings 3840 by 2160. And we wanted to, say, bring that media in. And let's go ahead and grab a background instead. And let's bring in our merge node and let's bring that in. Now, one thing to note is if I look at our little merge node, we're sitting at 3840 by 2160 because that's being dictated by our background size, which, remember, by default is going to create it on our timeline size. But I did bring another piece of media in. If I input that into our merge, now we're back to 4096 by 2160. And that's because our background on our merges dictates the resolution of our little fusion composition. So what you would want to do is just make sure you bring in a background. So you're sitting at 3840 by 2160. We can input that, and now our footage is sitting at the right size within our little composition, but you notice it's too large. So this is where you could either leave it like that and just move your footage around. You can easily add a transform node on there and move your footage around if you want. But if you wanted to crop that down correctly, we could add a crop node. Just add it, and it's going to automatically crop to our 3840 by 2160. And then we can go in here and use our offset to offset that however we want. Same goes with our smaller footage. So if I brought in another merge, bring this in, and we had smaller footage here, and I input that. So now we've got our smaller footage. I could just use the resize node, and by default, it's going to resize it to our timeline setting. So now that footage is resized correctly. So one thing to note is, go ahead and delete these, is there is a flow of our sizing operations. So if I look at this graphic here, this is how our sizing operations flow within DaVinci Resolve and Fusion. So it starts off with our super scale, which means if I go here, we can see our little super scale settings down here. So if we're using super scale and we change the size of our scaling, that's the first thing it's going to take into account. Next, it's going to take into account our lens correction. So if I go here and we change our lens correction, I know it's not actually changing the size, but it is resizing a little bit. So it takes into account our lens correction from our edit and cut page. Then any fusion transforms that we have. Then after our fusion transforms, any transforms we have on our edit and cut page. So any of these sizing transforms that we have, it takes those into account. After that, any input and output sizing is taken into account. And what that means is on here, if I was to use stabilization and I stabilized our footage, and this footage is already stabilized, so it's really not going to do anything. But if we have any zoom or resizing for our stabilization, that's our input and our output sizing. So that's going to be last on the list of how it resizes your footage in the little DaVinci Resolve / Fusion workflow. Now, as far as bit depth goes, our color bit depth, Fusion within Resolve Studio is always going to operate off float 32. So our default is float 32. And no matter what we do, even if we change our settings, it's going to create float 32. So if I bring in, say, just a little background, look at our background, float 32. Bring in a text node, look at our text, float 32. If I say, bring in some stuff I know is not float 32, like we've got this little teeny tiny JPEG image, which is not float 32, it's still operating under float 32. So no matter what you do within DaVinci Resolve and Fusion, it's always going to operate on Float 32. Now the standalone has much more options to change your project settings from different bit depths, but the Fusion within DaVinci Resolve is only going to operate on Float 32 unless you tell it to change. And the only way to tell it to change is by using depth change nodes. So let's go ahead and fit this back in. So if I hit shift space, DEPTDE change depth, and I use a change depth node, I can go to my change depth node and I can say I want this to be integer 16. So if I look, now we're operating on integer 16 and that flows all the way through. So if I look at our media out, integer 16. So if we wanted to have multiple different little bit depths here, so let's delete these. Let's bring in our cheesy little logo here again. And if I input it, we're still operating on integer 16 because that's what we told it to change. So if I was to remove this, now we look, we're operating on float 32, but as soon as I input this and change our bit depth on our little logo here, and I look at our output, it's still float 32. That's because our background is dictating what our actual bit depth is. So even though on this we changed our media to be operating from float 32 to integer 16, as soon as we go to our merge node, we're back to float 32. So if you wanted to change everything on here, you would remove that and put it after your merges or before your media out if you want. Or you could copy this, stick that there, stick that there. Now you know you're still on integer 16. But just remember, your background is going to determine what your overall bit depth is. So if I go to our change bit depth and change this to integer 8, now our media out is sitting at integer 8. If I want to change it back to float 16, now it's sitting at float 16. So this change depth is the only way we can change our bit depth of anything we're working with within Fusion. And again, for the standalone version of Fusion, it's different. You can change it independently per image, and you can change your overall project. But again, float 32 only within DaVinci Resolve Fusion. And the only way you can change your bit depths is using change depth nodes. So I hope that clarifies some stuff when it comes to resizing your resolution and your bit depths of your projects. In our next episode, we're going to go over one more boring thing when we talk about color. So I will see you in the next episode.